Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. Today we're going to be talking about liberalism again. Topic today is going to be specifically the classical roots. We're going to talk about Athens, and if I still have the energy, we may go into Rome. And if I don't, Rome's going to be the next show. Before then, though, I want to make a few notes. The first is personal. I am still out of work. I lost my day job on January 30th, for those who haven't followed me on social media. And I have been looking for something new ever since, and I still have not found it. At the moment, between a retirement account from my last job and unemployment, and food stamps, I am making it by right now, and I'm not immediately in any trouble. But I need an income stream soon, and I'm still looking for a day job. But in the meantime, if somebody really wants to help, the best thing they could do is go over to the Patreon or find me on Substack and subscribe. I could really use the support right now. Even if you subscribe as a free member and share my stuff, that helps. Though obviously, if you can help me get paid for my work, that's great too. But even just a free subscription and sharing the content helps. And of course, if you watch this on YouTube and you enjoy it, mash that like button, share it somewhere, hit the subscribe button, turn on the alerts. I try to do a show every Sunday when I have either a guest or the energy to do something by myself. And I try to make it interesting and educational and useful. I'm not an expert on anything, of course. I know a little bit about everything, but I hope people use this show and my conversations with other people or myself as a starting point to learn more about this stuff yourself. Um, like I said, this liberalism project is being accompanied by some writing. I have the final draft of part one done, and that's going to go up this week. I'm going to start on part two very soon as well. In the meantime, I want to also cover a few of the ongoing things right now. The most the most disgusting thing in the news right now, though it's really hard to decide what's most disgusting. I mean, we are still bombing Iran, even though nobody's talking about it. But the most disgusting thing in the news right now is that a 7-month-old baby was shot in the face by the IDF in Gaza. Uh, and I just want you to think about that for the moment. The quote unquote most moral army in the world shot a baby in the face. And this is our U.S. ally. This is the country that has a right to exist, according to every politician in America. Now, no country has a right to exist, but I would argue that a country that is ordering its military to shoot babies in the face is particularly deserving of losing its national status. Nationhood is not some magic button. Nations are political polities that are supposed to benefit people. If Israel's benefit for its citizens is stealing land by shooting babies in the face, that country shouldn't exist. That nation state shouldn't exist in that fashion. When people talk about Israel's right to exist, I wish they would discuss where rights come from and how they're balanced by responsibilities more, and the fact that rights are for people and not countries. So, just something to think about. Also, I've been thinking a lot about electoralism lately, not because I'm a big believer in elections. I tend to I tend to fall back on anarchist abstentionism, which is to say, I see elections as an opportunity to talk about issues and to use personalities running to make points, but I'm not usually super invested for candidates. Sometimes I'm super invested against candidates, and a little bit of that has been happening this go around. Saikat Chakrabarti, who lost a primary in California and will not advance to the general election. Though both of the people who will advance to the general election are Democrats because of the way California's system works. Saikat Chakrabarti lost in San Francisco. I think that's good. The local progressive advanced to the general instead, as opposed to Saikat, who is a former Stripe engineer and tech millionaire, who is the money behind groups like Justice Democrats, Brand New Congress, Rebellion PAC. So basically, the guy funding what you think of as the progressive Democratic establishment. And that's a good way to describe them. They've become an establishment, a group of people who try, not always succeed, but try to define progressivism against the rest of the Democratic Party, and sometimes succeed and sometimes fail. But that's important to understand. This guy, Saikat Chakrabarti, is the guy who funds most of what we would consider the progressive movement, and through that, the progressive media. He's personally buddies with people like Nathan Robinson from Current Affairs and Ryan Grimm from Drop Site News. He used to work for The Intercept, so he knows people there. There's all this sort of stuff going on. I'm sorry, Saikat didn't work for The Intercept. Ryan Grimm used to work for The Intercept. He knows people there. My apologies. But there's all these people are networked together around money that is essentially coming through Saikat from Silicon Valley. He's a tech libertarian. He and his campaign manager, Zach Exley, had a short-lived podcast. In one episode, they talked about how they were really taken aback by how the traditional Marxist and anarchist left had sort of seized on Brand New Congress. And they felt like it wasn't doing what they wanted it to do, because instead of becoming a sort of big tent libertarian group, it instead became a very sort of hyper-partisan socialist group, and they're not really socialists. That podcast has been deleted, but some people found it and put it on the internet for a congressional race. It's worth understanding that this guy isn't really a leftist and didn't like that his organizations took off with the left so much. And the same people, the same money, the same establishment are the people who are lined up trying to tell us that Graham Plattner, who is also advancing to the general election in Maine, it looks like, Graham Plattner is the best we can do as far as leftist goes. Never mind that there was a progressive with all the same policy positions as Plattner who doesn't have all the horrific skeletons that have been crawling out of Plattner's closet lately in the race, and nobody ever even learned his name. And I'm guilty of that too. I can't remember his name. So that's pretty bad. I'm guilty of what I'm calling out. But at the same time, it's important to understand that the reason I don't know his name is we've been bombarded with just Plattner all the time. And people were, with both Saikat and Plattner, people were told, it's this guy or some conservative, when in both cases there were other progressives in the race. And it just goes to show how an establishment can be a bad thing. there's very much a progressive establishment. The Intercept, Current Affairs, the Young Turks, the Majority Report, uh, Kyle Kalinske, Crystal Ball, Brianna Joy Gray. All these people know each other. All these people are friends. All these people used to be paid by the same people or still are paid by the same people. And a lot of that money goes through PACs that are essentially psychots babies. And that's worth understanding. And it's worth understanding why somebody like me, who was gung ho for progressive Democrats in 2020, has been slowly backing away from the Democratic Party and thinking less about electoralism and more about meaningful forms of direct action, and of course, most of all, mutual aid. We need to be organizing for mutual aid and self-defense and community defense no matter what. Mutual aid and mutual defense are how we're going to survive what's coming. Unless something drastic happens, I don't see anything getting better in the near future. I believe the Democrats are going to take Congress by a big margin, maybe take back the Senate. I don't know about that. The numbers are tougher. But I do think the Democrats are going to end up with a slim majority in government to counter Trump. And they may or may not oppose him, but we're not going to see meaningful change from the Democrats. We didn't see that meaningful change under Biden. What we saw under Biden was multiple attempts to placate Republicans in various ways rather than service his Democratic constituency. And I think we're going to see that again if the Democrats take back Congress. We're going to see them maybe shame Trump into putting his name on a few things that don't suck. If you all remember COVID checks, for instance, that's one example. But other than that, I can't see much happening. We'll see. So since we're talking about electoralism, that's not quite the clean segue I want, but let's start talking about where some of these ideas about liberalism originally come from. Now, obviously, classical democracy in Athens and other Greek city-states was not liberal by modern terms. But ideas about classical democracy in Greece were very much important to liberal ideas, as would be ideas about republicanism in Rome. And these ideas would be extremely important to the evolving liberal thought processes in the United Kingdom many years later, or what would become the United Kingdom, England first, where a lot of this stuff from the classical world gets really translated into the modern industrial world, pre-industrial, just about industrial capitalist world in interesting ways. So Athens, I think, is a good place to start. Athens is where we get is where Western ideas of democracy come from in a modern sense. Athens was not the only Greek democracy. Syracuse was a democracy. The famous Sybaris, the Sybarites, that was a democracy. Several other cities in Greece were democracies. Thebes was a democracy for a long time. And at the same time, there were also oligarchies in Greece. And the oligarchies, as far as the historical record shows, sort of came first. And those oligarchies became these sort of warrior aristocracies, or maybe warrior aristocracies became oligarchies. It can be very murky. Does the pirate or the trader come first, and how often are the pirate and the trader the same guy? But anyway, you get this in Athens. Democracy didn't happen right away. There was an aristocracy. As near as history shows, Athens never really had a king. They had some tyrants, but they had a constitutional system similar to democracy, but controlled by oligarchs and aristocrats. Um, the the first tyranny, Pisistratus, was essentially in many ways a popular revolt against aristocracy. Pisistratus overthrew the quote unquote constitutional system and became a tyrant. Now, this is what tyranny meant in ancient Greece, that he overthrew the constitutional system and took power. Pisistratus, the history is mixed, but quite a lot of what's written about Pisistratus is positive. He made things better for the ordinary people. He kept the aristocrats in their place. He was sort of a prototypical authoritarian socialist strongman, if you like. He equalized property ownership among citizens. He expanded citizenship. He protected ordinary citizens from some of the harsher Athenian laws. He was generally considered positively by most contemporary Athenians, except the people he overthrew. At the same time, he was a tyrant. He took power illegally and kept it by force. This is one of these central contradictions. The popular hero is also an authoritarian strongman. You see this a lot in the classical world, where a popular hero is supported in becoming a tyrant by what would otherwise be considered a democratic faction. Prior to actual democracy, the proletariat, proto-proletariat, if we like, the most marginalized members of the free citizen population of Athens were mobilized to put Pisistratus in power in order to get their fair share. Later Athenians would call Pisistratus a demagogue, and they would frequently call other progressives are demagogues, and there's some legitimacy to this because a lot of the progressives in Athens were also fairly strong nationalists and imperialists, which is another tie between classical Athens and liberal Britain that's worth thinking about. Athens was also a naval power, just like the UK. So there are parallels here that make it give the UK reasons to be like, oh, Athens. All these parallels, and I find those kind of interesting too. But so Pisistratus was succeeded by his sons, which didn't happen very much in Greek city-states. They generally didn't have hereditary monarchies except in Sparta. They usually had some sort of either aristocratic community governance or democracy based on their constitutional system as it worked for them. Pisistratus's sons were not thought well of. They became extremely unpopular very quickly. They were seen as corrupt and arbitrary and primarily interested in enjoying the fruits of power as opposed to doing the business of making the trains run on time. And if the strong man can't make the trains run on time and keep the people who put him in power happy, he doesn't stay happy. A famous pair of gay lovers assassinated one of the sons and were lionized in Athenian lore because of it. And the other son was overthrown with the help of soldiers from other city-states, and they restored the constitutional government. After the restoration of the constitutional government, you get the you get the beginnings with Cleisthenes, who may have been a tyrant himself, we're not quite sure, but who set the stage for what we would call the Athenian democratic constitution. And so he was intended that if he was he was going to be tyrant, he was going to be the last tyrant, at least in theory, and Athens would be governed by its people thereafter. And this is where these ideas about the combination of democracy and civic patriotism come from. Athens was a city-state, small place where most of the citizens could know each other. Most of the people who lived in the city fell into three categories of non-citizens: slaves, who were just that, slaves. They had certain protections under the law, but they were not free. They did not have any citizens' rights. They had legal protections and the privileges that their masters chose to give them. The second group was foreigners, who likewise were not citizens and not voters, even if they had lived in Athens for, all their lives. And in many cases, even if they were born in Athens, but their parents were foreigners. There was a large foreign population in Athens with no rights who had lived in Athens for generations, but because their ancestors came from somewhere else and weren't part of the original families of the demos, they weren't given they didn't have any representation in government. And the final group was what they called metics, METICAS, who were either freedmen or the children of freedmen and citizens, or the children of foreigners and citizens. And metics had more privileges than foreigners and slaves, but not full rights of civic participation in government. So you have class early on. You have aristocrats who originally ran the system. You have tyrants who overthrew the aristocrats on behalf of common people, people who considered themselves common, but who are really the least affluent portion of the citizenship, supported by people, and were usually supported when it came to civic revolution by representatives of the unrepresented classes, hoping to get social mobility out of all this. And you see citizenship opened up to more people at various times in Athens because of these sorts of movements. But the citizen pool was always a relatively small part of the population. That's one of the reasons that people talked about Athenian democracy as freedom for slave owners. All the citizens were well off enough to own slaves. If you were a citizen, the system seemed fairly socialist. If you were not a citizen, it seemed pretty capitalist. It was neither really, it was a sort of proto-slave capitalism. The slavery complicated everything, but at the same time, slaves were what we would call capital now and were used in commercial businesses. And unlike chattel slavery later on, you had to pay slaves. And in Athens, there were rules about what you could and couldn't do to punish them. Unlike some societies later on, you couldn't just kill slaves for no reason, or even kill them for a reason without some sort of legal proceedings. Slaves didn't have the same protections as free people, and foreigners and metics didn't have the same privileges as citizens. And there were marginalized, quote, proletarian, unquote, citizens and wealthy aristocrats and oligarchs. And these classes would be fairly important to Athenian politics. The citizens were divided between a democratic faction that represented all the citizens who weren't aristocrats and at least some of the interests of foreigners and medics, and gave lip service to the idea of expanding legal protections for slaves. Um, and you had an aristocratic faction that tended to talk about peace and stability, and mostly what they meant was their own power. Um, Ironically, as things went on, the democratic faction also became the imperialist faction, a deep contradiction. It was the Athenians' league, a very democratic league originally, to fight the Persians, to carry the war from Greece to Persia after the Persian invasions were defeated, the Delian League, which eventually became a tool instead for Athenian empire. And there were more and more of Athens' wars were with its own allies and neighbors than with Persia because of this imperial tendency. But still, Athens is where we get ideas like free speech, free assembly, the right to a jury trial, peers instead of just the magistrate, elected representatives of various kinds. And Athens was very aggressive about spreading this democracy to other cities. Athenian colony cities were democratic, run by the colonists, and tended to trade fairly peacefully with their neighbors. Though, of course, obviously, you're making a settlement, you're willing to fight for it. So there's an imperial aspect to this too, still, but it was more commercial than military for the most part. And this Athenian idea of democracy and the rights of the citizen would be very important later on to people in classical Greece. And it was this democracy, the empire that this democracy built, contradiction, and the war with aristocratic Sparta, whose armies were commanded by kings, another contradiction, since Sparta was fighting against the Athenian Empire in a way that many modern imperial theorists might call liberatory, but was in no way a free or liberated state. Sparta was a military dictatorship, and the cities that were subject to it or that were its colonies were ruled by similar military dictatorships, which is important to when we talk about sort of the birthplace of classical liberal ideas in philosophy. A lot of classical liberalism starts with British interpretations of Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, was a student of Plato. Plato was a student of the very famous but extremely mysterious Socrates. And Socrates, who we know a whole lot about secondhand, but nothing firsthand, and almost nothing personally, may or may not have been the formation of Plato's philosophy, and may or may not have been supportive of Athenian democracy, but was sort of the father of what we would call modern critical thinking or critical theory. Socrates, at least as Plato's character, and it's really important to understand that we best know Socrates as a fictional character in a series of fictional discussions written about by Plato in order to communicate Plato's ideas. So we best know Socrates as a mouthpiece for Plato. But Plato was not Socrates' only student. Socrates had three other reasonably famous students. Xenophon, who was an Athenian politician and soldier and author and philosopher, and who worked as a mercenary for Persia, of all things, after the Persian wars with Greece. He worked for a usurper in a Persian civil war. Alcibiades, who was a politician and soldier and a central figure in the Peloponnesian War, changed sides with when the opportunity presented itself and necessity made it beneficial, defected from Athens to Sparta and back again, was actually thrown out of the city by the Athenians before defecting to Sparta. And when he could legally come back, he did, and went back into his Athenian political life like nothing had happened. It's fascinating. Third was Antisthenes, who was an important philosopher. We don't know him as well as Plato, but he was an early Cynic and was considered very important as a founder by the founders of the Stoics. His opinion that what was most important about Socrates was his ethics and his ethical criticism of the world around him, which brings us back to critical theory. And it's this, which sort of conforms with what Plato tells us in that, Plato's Socrates is constantly being critical of everything in order to learn more about it, though Antisthenes suggests that Socrates had deeply formed ethical opinions and more asked questions in order to criticize society and show how silly it really was, which Plato seems to get up to a point, but Plato seems to have more active ideas about what society should look like instead, whereas Socrates was more, well, might there be better ways to do this? Also, a much less famous but important student of Socrates called Critias. And Critias's importance is that he was the leader of the brutal dictatorship set up by Sparta to run Athens for them as a puppet state after Sparta won the Peloponnesian War. And there were so many contradictions in the Peloponnesian War that it's worth talking about a bit too, I think. The Delian League, as I said, had been set up to fight against Persia. It was called the Delian League because the treasury was kept on an island called Delos, according to the original treaty. And as the League started to be less important for a war with the Persians and more important as a means of Athenian soft power, an important act of the government of Athens was to move the treasury of the Delian League from Delos to Athens and start treating it as if it was a portion of the Athenian military budget, under the theory that the Athenian navy was the most important part of the league against the Persians. This started, of course, to make the Athenian empire more obvious and more about the navy than the soft power that originally put it together. And Athens started fighting wars with its so-called allies that eventually escalated into the Peloponnesian War, in which the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, organized to fight against the Delian League, led by Athens, with the intent of breaking Athenian hegemony over the peninsula on which both Athens and Sparta were built, the Peloponnesus. So the Peloponnesian War starts because liberal Athenians committed to democracy in Athens were treating their colonies and allies like subject states instead of equal partners. And with the obvious hard power of hegemony in their face, they allied with aristocratic military dictatorship Sparta to free themselves from Athens. I keep talking about this because it's such a deep contradiction. The people fighting for their liberty from a foreign tyrant, if you will, occupier, was a brutal military dictatorship looking to establish its own sort of soft power control over Athens' former allies and replace Athens as the state with all the hegemony, the power. And that's what happened ultimately, despite being in a stronger position to start. Ultimately, Athens lost. A government was installed by Sparta, and the Athenians rose up against this government and ultimately overthrew it in a very democratic, revolutionary sort of way that would have been quite heroic if we hadn't remembered that they got themselves occupied because they were trying to rule all their neighbors. And then there was another war against Sparta led by Thebes to destroy Spartan hegemony. At which point, there are so many possibilities opened up, but ultimately the Macedonians and then the conquered Greece and the Romans conquered the Macedonians. But the reason I mention the Peloponnesian War is the fact that it led to the 30 tyrants, as I said, brutal military dictatorship ran by one of Socrates' students called Critias, harshly enforced Spartan authority in Athens, punished a lot of war criminals, as the winners always do after wars. It's only the war criminals on the losing side who ever face justice in war. That's one of the reasons socialists oppose war in the majority of circumstances. And Athens overthrew this tyranny. And it is in this context that the execution of Socrates and the formative politics of Plato come about. If you've read The Republic, you know that Plato had some ideas that we would consider eugenicist and fascist today. He certainly did not have ideas about equal access to education. He believed in a tiered educational system where the elite were the most educated, and the most educated would rule as philosopher kings. This would be copied later on, and we may get to that in a later phase of liberal thought, which would be called enlightened despotism. But at the time, it was fairly blatantly anti-democratic. The Athenian democracy thought highly of Plato's writing and much of his ideas, but the Republic itself was sort of an attack on Athenian democracy. And it's worth understanding the context of the Socrates that Plato sets up as his hero in the Republic. Socrates' students were a guy who went to work for the Persians as a mercenary and sided with the aristocrats in politics generally, Xenophon. Alcibiades, a traitor and opportunist who was thrown out by the Athenians for corruption, allegedly, became a Spartan military officer for the 10 years he was thrown out of Athens, and then defected back to Athens to continue his political career and fight against Sparta as if nothing had happened. And then he lost. He was on the losing side of the war, not the winning, despite all his promises. And the actual military dictator who who led the occupation government, the puppet government, Critias. So Socrates' charge of corrupting the youth might have been taken into it, might have been levied because they were blaming him for things that his corrupt students did. If you look at Xenophon and Alcibiades and Plato and Critias, you can make the argument, especially with Critias, Alcibiades, Socrates' students, some of Socrates' most famous students were corrupt. And because Socrates set such great store in himself as a teacher of ethics, the government of Athens was bringing him to account for the ethics of his students since he was a teacher of ethics. Now, this was not a liberal thing to do by our modern standards. But the contradiction here is that the Athenians believed they were defending their democracy from an anti-democratic influence who was teaching anti-democratic ideas in the way he criticized the democracy. How much of what Plato taught Socrates really thought we'll never know. Antisthenes didn't think Plato's politics were as important as Socrates' ethics, and was fairly abstentionist himself when it came to politics. He was sort of a founding cynic, remember. Cynics were not big on political participation, like Socrates himself. Another charge brought against Socrates was that despite his supposed wisdom and ability in learning, he was unwilling to serve his time in the government, which was something every Athenian was supposed to do. Xenophon's writing about Socrates says he was a military hero and a very good soldier who always served his time against the Persians. But, and this is an important but, he refused to do the things that a good soldier was supposed to do after his original service, which is he did not serve as a general. He did not run for office to be a strategos or a polemarch, the two primary military positions in Athens, both of which were elected. He didn't use his so-called wisdom to stand for archon and serve as a civil judge or civil administrator. And so he was, while setting himself up to teach, not willing to share his own learning with society in a political way, as the Athenians saw it. And this is sort of an early exercise from the Athenian point of view of Popper's paradox of tolerance. We'll get to that much later in talking about liberalism, but Socrates was a threat to the liberal order and had to be dealt with because he was talking too much about the underpinnings of the so-called proto-liberal order, the democratic order. Liberals ultimately came out as against slavery in the end, chattel slavery in the day, and in theory, Athenian slavery too. But still, it was the people who would have considered themselves the most democratic and progressive and populist of their era who told Socrates to drink the hemlock. And that, again, is based on the idea that they couldn't tolerate Socrates's intolerance of the system from their point of view. He was teaching people to be opportunists and aristocratic strongmen and military dictators serving the opposition. Plato, whose thoughts were very, very, very popular later on with the Romans, would go on to found the Academy. His most famous student at the Academy, of course, is Aristotle. And Aristotle gives us the idea of the golden mean, the perfect life of what he calls the magnanimous man. The magnanimous man, by our modern standards, is a gentleman. He's a man of property, a man of wealth, a man who's capable of participating in the political arena of his day, which means he's free, he owns property, and he might be an aristocrat, depending on the setting. So with all this in mind, Aristotle's idea of the golden mean is the real beginning point for what later British liberals would call liberalism. Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, which can very, very roughly be boiled down to moderation in all things, is this idea that a gentleman should be magnanimous. He should be he should be harsh with his enemies, but not too harsh. He should be kind to his friends, but not too kind. He should be patronizing to his social inferiors, but not too patronizing. He should be austere in his political dealings, but not too austere, and so on and so forth. And what it really comes down to is a gentleman should be educated, a critical thinker, and always think about the right thing to do in the circumstances he is in a way that will offend the least amount of people and appear as respectable as possible. This is what magnanimous in modern English is a synonym for liberal. The British idea of liberality comes directly from Aristotle's magnanimity, and Aristotle's magnanimous man would fit in perfectly with the Whigs and Tories of early British parliamentary democracy as it existed. He's a member of an aristocratic social club that had a monopoly on power, but was supposed to use that monopoly on power for the good of everyone, which kind of starts to sound like capitalism and the ideas of capitalists under liberalism too, when you think about it. And this was really important. This Aristotelian idea of the magnanimous man would be important to the Greeks, the Macedonians, the Romans, all the way down to British Whigs and liberals in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this proto-liberalism of Aristotle is what combines with another military dictatorship very similar to Sparta in Rome to produce the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, of course, existed before it became Hellenized, and was Hellenized before it conquered Greece. But the wars with Macedonia that made the Roman Republic a world power, that made it an empire before it had an emperor, and that established its cultural authority as the senior partner in a alleged political federation with the Greeks, though in actuality they ruled the Greeks as a subject state, is where a lot of our founding fathers here in the U.S. got their ideas. And the Roman Republic from the beginning was built on class warfare. Rome had kings. We don't know much about the real kings. We have names of legendary kings. Uh, the king's job was to lead the army and be a judge and to serve as a ceremonial religious figure. Uh, and the king gradually acquired more and more political power. And a legendary figure named Brutus, not the famous Brutus from Shakespeare, but his potentially mythical ancestor, led an uprising against the last king, defeated him, threw him out, defended his city from a counter invasion, and during the counter invasion killed his own sons when they attempted to betray the republic to the former king and reestablish the monarchy. Killed his own sons for freedom, made the ultimate sacrifice, slew the enemies of the republic. Now think about that. We're talking about an authoritarian who murdered his own sons for a political reason, as the central hero of Roman mythology and in its mythical history. Another contradiction, as the Republic would become associated with corrupt aristocrats, and the empire was ultimately founded by progressive forces fighting against aristocratic rule and trying to include more Romans and even including more members of the empire as Romans. Another sort of expression. This was an expression of Aristotle's magnanimity that the British would later consider very liberal. And ideas about aristocratic Rome and its republic were very important to the aristocratic landowners who founded the American Republic. Ideas about aristocratic Rome and its republic were very important to the British Whigs who founded the British Republic. Some form of Roman Republican institutions still survived in Anglo-Saxon Britain and had been Germanized into assemblies that made decisions on who could and couldn't be kings. And these later assemblies about who could and couldn't be kings would form the basis of the parliaments, which would ultimately put the king in his place and establish a constitutional monarchy with significant democratic elements, despite never actually establishing the republic to which British Whigs claimed to aspire. Why that republic never happened is going to be a subject for the next show. But before we get to the English Civil War and Cromwell's failures, I want to talk a little bit about those Anglo-Saxon institutions that with their Roman roots and the forms they took. The Anglo-Saxons had what they called the Wittingamo, which was a conference of all the important nobles and their retainers and a significant number of representations of townsfolk and what were called churls. Churls were free landowners who were not aristocrats, who were not earls. And the rank in the Saxon monarchy was fairly simple. You had kings, you had earls, you had churls. The churls were the freeholders who supported the earls. They were not serfs. The serfs in Saxon society were called thralls and were much in the same situation as the slaves of the Athenian or Roman period, just a different name to it. And the theory that they were bound to land rather than owned to people, much like the actual serfs of France and later Norman England. But with this in mind, It's important to understand that the Saxon kings were at least formally elected, that if the son of the king wasn't considered a responsible adult, he would frequently be passed over for someone else at a Wittengamo. During the Viking conquest, while they were actually fighting wars with the Danes, when first the Danish king Canute conquered England, and then the English king Aethelred, with the support of his son, who would become king and be known as Edmund Ironside, conquered the kingdom back. And then Edmund Ironside became the next king and died very quickly with only minor children. Edmund Ironside's minor children were passed over, and the Saxon Wittengamo, based on the idea that a responsible adult should be king, freely elected the Viking conqueror Canute king of the English, because he was a responsible adult and was considered to be a decent guy, despite the fact that they had invaded him, he had invaded them, which is a really weird and contradictory idea that you almost have to be an Anglo-Saxon earl of the period to understand. But they decided the kingdom has to be ruled by an adult, and we are going to elect our conqueror rather than continue to fight against him with kids as our kings and some regent running things for them, which is really a very liberal thing to do if you think about it. And that's my joke for the day. The most liberal thing you can possibly do is elect your own conqueror king of your own free will, because he's a responsible adult and your liberator's heirs are minors. And that, of course, led to a series of succession disputes as Canute's oldest son was elected, got ground down in a war with his own successors, died, and then they brought the legitimate kings back, and both the Danes and the Saxons agreed, hey, let's let these English heirs be kings again. And boom, England is back to having an English king, just like that. Though those English kings were raised in Normandy and had lots of Norman ideas, and ultimately Edward the Confessor would decide that possibly a Norman should inherit, which led to a succession dispute and a war. And that's why we call William the First of England the Conqueror. And it was with William's conquest of England that these ideas developed even more. And the next show will be about liberalism in England up to the point where they actually started to call it liberalism and what happened then. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me this week. Again, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. If you enjoyed the show, please like it, share it, follow me on social media. I'm Eclectic Rad Show on Twitter and Eclectic Radical on Blue Sky, Substack, and Patreon. If you want to actively support the show, you can subscribe to Eclectic Radical on Patreon or Substack. I really need all the help I can get getting paid for the work right now, for the simple reason that it's the only work I've got until I find a day job. I appreciate everyone who stuck it out. I will be back next week, still no guest, to talk about proto-liberalism and early liberalism in England and the United Kingdom. Until then, I'll tweet at you.